I gotta say I really love the aesthetic of this game. The geometry is really simple with hard edges and everything. It feels really cheap, but the textures are really high resolution. It seems to me that none of the textures have been baked, rather they've all been hand painted in something like Photoshop with Quixel or something like that. I wouldn't do this in Painter usually because Painter, as of this recording, doesn't really have that great transformation tools or simple box tools like a rectangle tool. So this process would be a lot quicker and easier to do in Photoshop, where you have some simpler tools available. It is a puzzle game, and the puzzle environments has been wisely put outside in a relaxing space with open sky. And the skyboxes are beautifully brushed skies with great use of color, which may allow you to take your mind off the task at hand for a while if you need something to disconnect to. And I can imagine the game would have been a lot more stressful if the puzzle environments had been placed in an interior somewhere with a claustrophobia factor or something like that. So putting it outside is a really great choice. While the environmental textures do tile a lot, you don't really get a lot of opportunities to see them from a distance to really notice. And most of the textures don't really have a lot of color contrast to them or truly recognizable patterns. The blocks that are used fits perfectly within a squared box for them to align on a snap grid. But most of them don't look like that because they have some cut-ins and some rectangular shapes within them. And they don't always utilize their entire boundary space. But from each side to the other, it does fit perfectly within a perfectly squared boundary. When looking at the block models, it seems that they have been sort of inefficiently made as far as the UVs and textures are concerned. While they do seem to be mirrored or have some UV overlaps, overlapping UVs to mirror the texture from one side to the other, since they do seem the same, there are some compression artifacts on one side which is not visible on the other, so that would indicate that they do not use the same texture space on the textures. So there is some room for texture optimization. So because I intend to recreate the model as closely as it is to the game as I can, or as I bother to try, I also have to try to copy how the UVs are laid out. Since the model has hard edges, it's a bit harder to see where the UV seams are, but I believe the model has been unwrapped with a simple projection tool, simply because of this tiny UV island right here, which is a lot brighter than the surrounding surfaces. So I believe the projection tool put that small face on a separate island, and due to the texturing process, which would be in Photoshop, it's a bit harder to have a seamless connection between the different islands. So this actually isn't the first time I did the modeling process, this is the second time. Because the first time I didn't respect the boundary, so I actually modeled the block to be outside its boundary, so if I implemented it into the game, the block would overlap the neighboring blocks. So I went back and redid the modeling so it can be correct. So the model which is shown here and the model which is shown in the texturing phase of the video, it's actually two different models, but it doesn't really matter because the texturing process is the same. It's just a slightly different UV layout. And I didn't like to mess up the perfect beveled edge right there, but it seems to me that the edge or the slope of the surface is actually a bit more steep than perfectly on a perfectly 45 degree. So I had to go in and kind of adjust that myself. Finding the correct alignment for the motor piece was a bit tricky, but I basically did it by comparing these lines to these lines as they sync up to the in-game model. And then I adjusted the belt to fit the motor piece afterwards. Creating this asset is a pretty quick and easy process since all the textures are hand painted, even the height or normal map. So when I'm gonna copy a model from this game, there's no need to make a high poly model of it because there's nothing to bake to. So I should only have to make the low poly model and put that into Painter and hand paint the normals myself, just like it is in this game. And this will save a lot of time. When I was uv-unwrapping the model, I tried to stay as close to how I think a UV projection tool would have unwrapped the model. But I did take some liberties to make it easier for me to fit it within a single texture set and material. Because I'm not quite sure how many materials the original in-game model uses, if it has everything on one single material, or if it, for instance, has the belts on a separate or something like that, since that is the only movable texture. But I am pretty critical of performance when I make a model, so if I can get away with one material instead of more for some reason, then I would always choose to fit everything on one material and find another solution for animating whatever the texture has to be animated. So when it comes to animating the belt on top, there's a lot of ways of doing that. And some of them are to, if the engine supports it, you could do it with UV animations. In that case, you could have it all in one material. You could also put the belts on a separate material and offset the entire texture within the engine. You could also put everything on one material and import the belt texture as a separate file and offset that texture in the material editor. Whichever method you choose, it's important that the UV island is at the very edge of both sides of the UV space. So when you offset the texture or the UVs, there are no pixels missed. Since I had to stretch the entire UV island of the belt across the UV space, there wasn't a lot of space left for the other surfaces, so I had to shrink them down a little bit to be able to fit them in there. So the belt on top actually has a bit more pixels allocated to it than the rest of the surfaces. So this is the first model that I made, which is a lot more square, which is a bit further from the original in-game model, but the texturing process is, as I said before, the texturing process is the same, so I'm just going to use this one. So I end up using the PBR shader here, even though I believe the game uses a classical diffuse specular shader, but I do try to hide it by setting the roughness to white and the metallic to black, so they shouldn't really have much of a factor of the appearance. The only difference now is that I would have to use these textures in a PBR engine, so I probably couldn't use it in the game engine that the original game uses. So whenever I work in Painter, I rarely use the paint layer. I almost always use the fill, even though if I intend to paint on the model. For instance, on the small holes on the sides of the belt machinery, I wouldn't paint that with a paint layer, because you cannot make changes with later. If you do it with a fill layer and paint on the mask instead, you can go back and change the height differences, so you can insert some color later. If you do it with a regular paint layer, you cannot go back and make changes. It's permanent there, so you have to erase it if you want to make changes to it. So use fill layers as much as you can, that's my advice. So right here I did have some problems making the arrows on not the arrows, but the patterns that is on the belt. So I thought I was gonna make it in Photoshop because it's much easier to do that there, but I decided to go back into Designer and make it there, so I can make some adjustable. I can make the width and height of it adjustable. I definitely could have made that a bit more easier for myself if I had just used the FX map to make a single stripe which passes through the entire thing, and just use a mirror node to mirror the top part down to the bottom. So because right now I have to deal with two parameters, and if the thickness and the length of the stripe is more or less than the other visually, then I don't get a sharp tip of the arrow point. At the time I wasn't quite sure what would be the most convenient way of applying the pattern, but I did end up choosing the least convenient way and just putting on a stencil and manually painting each stroke of it. But then I didn't really know if it was tiling on the sides or not. But I do go back and fix it later by removing all of this and putting it on a fill layer and applying the pattern to a mask instead. So right here it's important that you do not draw your height map outwards along the edge of the surface, because that can make some really strange artifacts. So instead of drawing the edges along the border outwards, I choose to draw the shape inwards, because then I avoid those artifacts along the edge. And also it would be a lot easier to go back and make this arrow in Photoshop or something like that. But you know, sometimes I just for some reason choose to do things more difficult for myself than it should be. In an attempt to be lazy, I just actually put in more work than I should have. So it's an ironic laziness, I guess. So basically what I'm doing here is creating a fill layer and setting the height of the entire fill layer to a certain value, and then I drew in all the entire imprinted place on the surface, and then I'm using the erase tool to erase out where I would not want the imprinted value to be. So the arrow is actually a unaffected area of the fill layer. So now I'll go back to the base color and make some small variations in the color. It's hardly noticeable actually, but your brain will notice if you make a surface which is just one single uniform color throughout, because you've never seen that in your real life before. Everything you've seen has at least some really tiny, small variations of pigments on its surface. It's kind of the mistake when people try to paint skin. They try to find the one correct skin color and just paint with that single color and think, oh, why can't I paint skin? That's because you're painting with a single color. Skin and everything else in this world is variations of lots and lots of colors. So painting in these small variations of color is pretty much essential to really sell the object or the material as something remotely close to real at all. And right now I'm baking the ambient occlusion, which is, I think it's one of the most important things when it comes to texturing. I can easily forgive some sloppy texture painting or whatever, but if there is no sense of shadowing or self-occlusion from light on an object, that is such a dead giveaway of it just puts the entire object, whatever style you're using, it puts it out of the environment which surrounds it, and I just cannot stand models with no sense of self-shadowing, unless the entire world is like that, then it makes sense. But finding the best ambient occlusion bake is worth the investment time. So the original model actually has these hand-painted light strokes on it. So in this case I actually used a paint layer and just painted in like that. It adds some artificial highlights to the model, and it actually works quite well. So this is the last time that I go back and fix the patterns on the belt. This is how I should have done it the first time around, which is just putting it on a fill layer and tile it, and use UV offset to align it. And once I got the thickness and the distance between them, I just erase the edges of it with a paint layer on the mask layer. And I do believe this is kind of how it's done in the game model as well, because the patterns are kind of has this weird squished shape as well. So this is actually probably closer to the actual model as well. So we only made a single object of the game here, but I think we have a pretty decent analysis of the game and its assets. I also made a recreated one of the blocks, and I believe it's kind of close to how the original workflow was, but obviously the original creator probably didn't use Painter. I can clearly tell myself there is some improvements to be made to make it closer to the in-game model, but this is close enough, I think.